this is Casey Roan, historian and board member with Maryland Milestones, APA. We're here at the fifth and final stop on our virtual women's suffrage bike tour. We're at the Bladensburg Waterfront Park to talk about the March of the Army of the Hudson. So in 1913, a group of women who dubbed themselves the Army of the Hudson walked all the way from New York City to Washington, D.C. to deliver a letter to newly elected President Woodrow Wilson asking for his support for women's suffrage. So this was a walk, a hike of over 200 miles in February and March of 1913. And they spent their very last night of the journey here in Bladensburg. Some of the hikers stayed at the George Washington House, which still stands nearby as the headquarters of the Annapolis Watershed Society, and others stayed at the Palo Alto Hotel. So there was actually a shortage of hotel rooms because so many curious onlookers had come up from Washington, D.C. that there was hardly anywhere for the actual members of the Army of the Hudson to stay. And this shows how highly popularized their march had been and how successful it had been in generating attention and enthusiasm for the suffrage cause. Here in Bladensburg, the Army was dealt a blow. Alice Paul, authorized by the National American Woman Suffrage Association, she came to visit the hikers and to take away from them the letter that they had carried all the way from New York. The National American Woman Suffrage Association had decided that it should be delivered in a more formal manner and it should no longer be handed off by the hikers, the marchers of the Army of the Hudson. And this must have been a really demoralizing blow to these women who had just nearly finished their 200-mile hike solely to deliver that letter. Nevertheless, the women of the Army of the Hudson departed Bladensburg the next day. They marched down the Bladensburg Road into the capital, where they were greeted by large and enthusiastic crowds who turned out to see their arrival. And then shortly thereafter, they joined the March 3rd, 1913 National Suffrage Procession, which was a huge, huge parade of suffrage supporters with over 5,000 people marching in the parade alone. This was a parade which was successful for the suffragists, but which also highlighted the racism that was embedded throughout the women's suffrage movement. African American were asked to march at the back of this 1913 suffrage procession. President Wilson did not express support for women's suffrage until midway through his second term. Nevertheless, the March of the Army of the Hudson was still a highly successful action which generated a lot of interest and support for women's suffrage, even if not from the president himself. And it spurred women suffragists around the country to embrace their tactics. Here in Maryland, the Just Government League began suffrage hikes and pilgrimages around the state in 1914, shortly after the March of the Army of the Hudson, where they would march or travel by covered wagon to more rural and remote areas of the state, which maybe hadn't been visited by suffragists before, where the women of the Just Government League would stop and deliver a little speech and hand out flyers. And through these hikes and traveling campaigns, they were able to sign on a lot of new members to their organization. They were able to do a lot of fundraising and to generate a lot of support for the cause. So even though the March of the Army of the Hudson did not immediately cause President Wilson to support women's suffrage, it was still, highly influential and shaped the tactics that were used throughout the rest of the women's suffrage movement. Because women were willing to engage in these grueling physical campaigns of activism, they were able to shift public support in favor of their cause in the long term. Thank you for joining us for our virtual women's suffrage bike tour. We're sorry that we couldn't be with you here in person, but I hope you enjoyed riding the route on your own. For more information about the Maryland women's suffrage movement and about the March of the Army of the Hudson along the Route 1 corridor, check out our longer video, which is a lecture solely about those topics. Thanks for joining us.